Welcome to Economy Disrupted. My name is Sarah Ladislaw, and I'm a non-resident senior fellow in the Energy Security and Climate Change program here at CSIS. In this series, we're looking at key disruptors shaping the U.S. economy and the future of U.S. international leadership. We're going to take a look at technology, trade, climate change, and the shifting workforce.
And I'm Matthew Goodman, Senior Vice President for Economics at CSIS and co-host of the program with Sarah. Delighted to have you with us this week. We're going to have a great discussion with a special guest in just a minute. Let me first thank our sponsor of the program, Howmet Aerospace Foundation, for their generous support. Very helpful to let us do this kind of programming, so we appreciate it. We're going to focus this week on economic disruptors in the great state of Oregon in the northwest of the U.S., and in a moment, Sarah will welcome our guest, Governor Brown of Oregon. But before we start the discussion, we're going to roll a short video about Oregon.
The northwestern U.S. state of Oregon is known for its geographically diverse landscape. Oregon was the destination for over 12,000 pioneers in the 1830s, traveling west along the Oregon Trail, the most used route in westward expansion. Today, Oregon's economy supports large agriculture and forestry sectors and active tourism, leisure, and hospitality industries. The state is a top U.S. producer of wine, hazelnuts, and Christmas trees. Anchored by Intel's operations in Washington County, Oregon is home to several producers of computers and semiconductors. The state also houses a robust outdoor and athletic apparel industry with Nike, Columbia Sportswear, and Adidas North America headquartered there. Oregon is deeply connected to the global economy. In 2020, the state exported around $25 billion in goods, accounting for over 11% of the state's gross domestic product. The majority of these exports went to China, Canada, Vietnam, South Korea, and Japan. Oregon also benefits from foreign investment. International companies employ over 70,000 workers in the state, about 30% of which are in manufacturing. Major sources of foreign direct investment include the United Kingdom, Japan, and Germany. This past year, the COVID-19 pandemic had a wide economic impact across Oregon. Unemployment rates peaked at 13% in April 2020 before falling to 6% in March of 2021. In the coming year, Oregon's leadership is continuing to fight the health and economic impacts of COVID-19. The governor's office has also prioritized fighting climate change, responding to and preventing wildfires in the region, and building a strong education system.
Great. And with that, we are very lucky, as Matt said, to have with us today Governor of Oregon, Kate Brown. Governor, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Wonderful. So we're going to start off asking questions, as we said, but we also want to remind the audience, if you'd like to ask questions towards the end, we're going to turn to your questions. So please use the Submit Questions button on the screen, and we'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. Governor Brown, I want to start somewhere that's near and dear to my heart. I've spent most of my career working on climate change and energy issues, and it's something that you've spent a lot of time, particularly over the last couple of years, focusing on. You know, what's interesting to me is Oregon actually has a fairly successful track record of renewable and clean energy, particularly in the electric power sector. Also, in terms of employment, contributing, 3 out of every 100 jobs or so in the clean energy economy. But you've taken steps further than that to propose a climate action plan through executive order that you've been moving forward on to make even more progress on that. One of the things that we've been talking about both at the national level and at the local level is how there is significant economic opportunity in dealing with climate change, but there's also skepticism about whether that is just abjectly economic opportunity or there's cost associated with that as well. It strikes me you've grappled with those things. How do you deal with advancing an ambitious climate policy that delivers on those things for the state of Oregon?
Well, I believe we have both a moral imperative as well as an economic imperative to tackle climate change. I will just tell you, on top of the pandemic this last year, we had historic wildfires in fall of last year, Labor Day weekend. Over 1 million acres burned. We lost 4,000 homes and 9 Oregonians. We still have 1,000 people living in motels in Southern Oregon. We have no choice but to tackle climate change. In February of this year, we had historic ice storms. Hundreds of thousands of people were knocked out of power for days. I happen to be one of them. We had to rely on the National Guard to do door knocking to make sure that our vulnerable community members were okay. We have no choice but to tackle climate change, and that's exactly what we're doing here, from solar, wind, geothermal, hopefully wave in the future. Hydro obviously has been a base of our power for the Northwest. So these are incredible job creation opportunities. I think it is a way, frankly, to bridge the urban-rural divide. Some of these jobs, a number of these jobs, particularly solar and wind, are located or provide economic opportunities in rural Oregon. So we think it's a win-win-win, and we think there is absolutely no choice but to move forward. I'm absolutely tickled that we have a federal administration that is making policy based on science and data. We lost two of Oregon's finest to the Biden-Harris administration to tackle climate change. So I am just pleased to have a very strong partner in the White House at this time. But Oregonians are seeing the impacts on the ground. The impacts are devastating, and they are most devastating in our historically underserved communities, our communities of color, our low-income communities, and our rural communities.
You mentioned the federal government, which I think obviously is a difference here, right? A change in terms of between administrations on dealing with this issue, particularly as a high priority issue. What are the types of things that working with the federal government or the business community are important in terms of advancing what you're trying to do, both on the mitigation side and then on the adaptation side? As you said, these impacts are expected to continue, and in planning for being resilient to them year over year is something that requires a lot of focus. What can you do to work with either the federal government or other states or other coalitions to tackle those issues?
Well, I think, first of all, to have a partner in the Biden-Harris administration that sees the realities and is willing to take action, that in and of itself is a huge win after the last administration. It enables us to partner and work together that I think are substantially increase our impacts. Whether it's working with individual secretaries or administrators, from Secretary Granholm on how do we transition to electric vehicle infrastructure and ensure that every single community in the West, both urban and rural, have access to this incredibly important infrastructure, and that low-income Oregonians and other Oregonians can afford to purchase EVs. You showed a picture of Daimler. They are working on making sure that our trucks are able to have EV technology and move forward and make that transition. So to have a federal administration that's willing to literally lay the groundwork and develop the infrastructure is huge. We cannot do this without the private sector. The business community is absolutely instrumental to our results and our ability to move forward successfully.
Excellent. Well, you mentioned technology a couple of times, and I know that's what Matt wants to talk to you about.
Yes, I would like to talk a little about technology, Governor. Oregon is famously known as the home of Silicon Forest. We saw some of the great companies you have based there. I saw somewhere that a study showed that you're the sixth ranked state in terms of patents per capita. So this is a state where technology and innovation are really central to your economic story. So why is that? Why is it become? What's the sort of environment that has created Oregon as a technology center? And what do you do? What do you need to do to maintain that, assuming that's what you want to do. And then, but actually, in that vein, if I can just slip in as well, I mean, technology on this program, we've been looking at it as a positive force, but it's also a disruptive force. It does replace jobs, and I think Sarah is going to talk more about that later. But just in terms of how you think about technology, is it something that is an enabler or a disruptive force, a little of both, and how do you manage all of that?
Okay, Matt, that was like 800 questions in one.
Sorry, I always do that. Sorry.
I'll try and separate them out and tackle them one by one. Let me talk about technology first, and specifically the internet. When the internet came on the scene, for me, what was really, really clear is that this technology was absolutely the answer to bridging the urban-rural divide, that our rural communities could have access and people could go there and work remotely. The challenge has been we haven't invested, both as a state and frankly as a country, in ensuring that our communities have access. I think what the Biden-Harris administration is doing in terms of sort of looking at this like this is the electrification of the country that happened during the Roosevelt administration. It's the same thing in my mind. And it's also so critically important after COVID. We have seen how we all rely on the internet and making sure that people have access, whether it's telehealth, whether it's going to school remotely, whether it's engaging viewers in conversations like these. So one of our imperatives is to make sure that all of our Oregon communities, regardless of how remote they are, have access to the internet, that our schools have access, that our businesses have access, that our libraries have access. And with the help from the federal government, we can get that done in the next handful of years. I think we can truly bridge the urban-rural divide with broadband access. In terms of Oregon's creativity and entrepreneurial spirit, it is true we tend to be one of the highest numbers of per capita patents filed in the country. I think it is in part due to the tech industry that is here, not just Intel, but also companies like Hewlett Packard as well, and then the hubs they create, the spokes that they create just by virtue of being located here. But there's something to Oregon. We are known as Mavericks, a bit of independent thinkers, very progressive in our public policy, very much creatives, entrepreneurs. And I think that is the spirit that thrives in communities large and small throughout the state. And Oregonians are very, very proud of that. You might, the film mentioned a little company by the name of Nike. That is, the company that literally was raised here in Oregon. And Phil Knight, being the founder, he and Bill Bowerman of that particular company, that industry is also very much a part of who we are as Oregonians. So we are entrepreneurs, we are innovators, we are thinkers, we are doers, and we are dreamers. And that, I think, creates a very unique Oregon spirit. In terms of technology, which I think was at the heart of your question, we had Pat Gelsinger here last week, toured the new fab that's being created on the site on the Intel campus in Hillsboro, Oregon. Pat said very clearly that this Intel site is the crown jewel of Intel, and we want to make sure that this company, as well as all of their offshoots, are able to grow and thrive. And I think that requires a lot of things. One, making sure that we have a diverse, skilled workforce, and making sure that we are making significant investments in our education system that allow all of our kids to have the opportunity to develop skills that will allow them to compete in a global economy. And that means obviously making sure some of them have the skills needed to participate in our thriving technology industry here.
Excellent. Okay, well, you not only answered all 800 of my questions, but also my prepared follow-up, which was to ask about broadband access. So you answered that nicely. So let me just sneak in one more, maybe two follow-ups before I turn back to Sarah, which is about picking up on your answer to her point about climate and working state and federal on this and working with the federal government. I mean, what is the federal government's role in all of this, including the broadband story, but on other dimensions of creating, a vibrant, economy with the access that you talked about? And do you, a sort of related question, again, I'm sneaking another one in, but do you talk to other governors about this stuff? I mean, do you coordinate your approaches or share your best practices or examples? Because we have talked to other governors and we're interested in how you all work together. So sorry to sneak in that one as well.
I'll answer that last question first. The short answer is yes, I do talk with other governors. We have a number of forums. But I also feel very comfortable reaching out to my colleagues and picking their brains or commiserating based on the circumstances of the moment. I'll just talk about both the National Governors Association. Most of the governors across the United States belong to that organization. It works across party lines. For example, we've been meeting weekly with Jeff Zients and team at the White House that are tackling the pandemic response. We have an opportunity to get information from experts and also ask questions. So that's one way we learn from each other. I also chair the Western Governors Association right now. It is a extremely bipartisan group of governors that work together to tackle the issues that we faced in the West. My initiative, for example, this year is how do we ensure that we can drive from California to North Dakota in an electric vehicle? How do we connect the local initiatives that are happening around EV infrastructure with the collaboratives, the broader collaboratives, for example, that are happening along the Pacific coast, and tie all of that together? And I'm really excited about that particular project. And I obviously talk with my fellow governors when we're figuring out tackling issues, dealing with specific projects like that. Your question about partnerships with the federal government, let me take two specific examples. I mentioned broadband, you mentioned broadband. We know for Oregon that it would take roughly $1.3 billion and roughly 5 years to connect the entire state. Those are not resources that a small state like Oregon has. Vast swaths of our state are extremely rural or remote, and it would be very expensive for us to do that. We have to rely on partnerships, obviously, with the private sector, with the nonprofit sector, but having the federal government say this is a priority gives me comfort, and I know that we can make that happen. Let me give you another example, and this is really about the changing perspectives as a result of the pandemic. Childcare. In Oregon, we lost many of our providers. 60% of our families saw their childcare systems disrupted as a result of the pandemic. We had hundreds of programs essentially fold. We have got to recreate the system and build it literally from the ground up. I don't believe there's a way that we can do this without significant investment from our federal partners. It requires continuing professional development. It makes, making sure that we have systems in place. But the reason why this is so incredibly important is that if we want our economy to thrive, not just here in Oregon, but across the entire country, we have to have quality, affordable daycare in our communities around the state. Businesses, the pandemic was a wake-up call. Businesses are like, oh my gosh, we're not going to be able to get the workforce we need without ensuring that we have solid systems of childcare in our communities. So we cannot, I think it would be extremely challenging for us to do that alone. With the federal government, yes, we can make it happen, and we can rebuild our childcare systems.
Thank you. Sarah?
Well, that's great. I mean, I wanted to turn to workforce issues, which I think obviously childcare is just such a huge part of that, of enabling sort of a recovery from COVID-19 and sort of a long-term healthy workforce as well as families. The thing I wanted to ask you is, here in sort of nationally, we're experiencing this debate, this tension over economic recovery versus job creation, right? And whether we're successfully recovering from COVID-19 in economic terms, but the workforce and the labor issues have sort of lagged a little bit. Oregon, I think you got the 6% unemployment rate, which is the national average, as it turns out, for March. How do you think about, in addition to the childcare dimension, which you just mentioned, thinking about building that workforce back in a COVID-19 recovery position, but then thinking again, tying it back to your long-term competitiveness, building the labor force of the future? What does that look like? How does Oregon sort of take the reins on an issue like that?
Great question. So how do we build back the workforce? So lessons learned from the 08-12 recession. If we do things exactly like we did in 08 to 12, we know that we will leave our communities of color behind. We will leave our low-income communities behind, and likely to leave our rural communities behind. So moving forward, and for the remainder of my term as governor, we are centering the voices of our historically underserved communities of color and low-income families and rural communities. That means centering the voices of Black and Brown, Black, African-American, Brown, Latino, Latina, Latinx, Asian, Pacific Islander, Indigenous, Tribal, and Native American, and communities of color. And so that looks a little different, and it requires us to take a step back and really listen and hear what these communities are saying and make significant changes and investments based on what they are saying. So I created a Racial Justice Council several months ago. They helped me on my budget development and my agenda for the legislative session, but I fully expect their voices to be front and center as we move into recovery. We have an economic opportunity subcommittee, and I am listening to those folks, those voices, in terms of how we do this. How do we do this differently? And how do we do this in a way that works for all of our community members?
And it sounds like you're still sort of in development stage on those plans, but can you give us an indication of what does that mean from a policy or investment perspective? Does it mean prioritizing different kinds of investment in the workforce, or is there a particular policy angle that comes out from that work so far?
So Oregon is truly Oregon is truly a small business state. Our small businesses are the heart and soul of our economy. And we want to make sure that our small businesses have the tools and resources to thrive. I am asking the legislature for a significant investment in capital assistance for our small businesses that are run by people of color, women of color, low-income Oregonians, and making sure that the capital investments are there for these entrepreneurs and these innovators. It also looks like making sure these folks have the technical assistance they need. So that's one example. In terms of workforce, I have to tell you, I think it starts with education and creating a seamless system of education, literally from cradle to career, that enables all of our kids to achieve their full potential. We are investing in early childhood education at levels that we have never done before. Again, we're hoping for a little help from the federal government as well on that, and we're getting some of that. But we know that there is an opportunity gap, a difference between the majority white population and our communities of color in terms of educational attainment. We have to close that opportunity gap. And I believe very strongly that by investing in early childhood education and frankly stamping it out before it begins, that we can ensure every kid has the opportunity to thrive, every kid has the opportunity to achieve what it is they want, their full dreams. So that is my goal. And then obviously workforce. I think higher education is going through a, what shall I just say, a wake-up call right now. I think our universities and colleges are going to look substantially different in 2 decades than they look right now. And I think based on Zoom technology or whatever device whatever system you're using, that folks are going to expect to be able to get a certificate, be able to change careers, do something much more fluidly and flexibly than you can right now. So we're having all those conversations. Again, it is about centering the voices of our historically underserved communities. It is about ensuring that opportunity is available for all. And it's about working together to create a more just and a more equitable Oregon.
Well, great. I'm going to ask you about trade, but before I do, let me just remind the audience that if you have questions, please submit them at the link that should be on your screen or below the screen. And we welcome those. We're going to take those in a second. But let me ask you, Governor, about trade. Your state is very dependent on trade. Something like 11% of your GDP, I think, is accounted for by exports. 500,000 jobs associated with trade, one way or the other. And so it's obviously important to your economic story, but it's also a disruptive force and one that we've been exploring in this series. And it's a politically difficult issue, certainly here in Washington. It's a almost toxic issue sometimes. And reflecting that, I think the new Biden administration has been pretty cautious so far about pushing forward an assertive trade policy. So I wonder, from your perspective, how important is trade and how important are trade agreements that might be negotiated here in Washington?
Well, you are exactly right that Oregon is in the top 10 of states most dependent upon trade opportunities. And so it's critically important for a state like Oregon. So in the prior administration, given the challenges that we faced, I felt it was incredibly important for me as the governor, as the chief executive officer of the state, continue to build those relationships and connect with our trading partners. So I continue to do that, obviously put on hold during the pandemic, but we worked via technology to continue to maintain those relationships. I would say it's primarily in sort of 2 categories. Chips, not potato chips, though that's obviously really important, but the semiconductor industry, and making sure that we can continue to get our products that we make here where they need to go, but also that they have the supply chain that they need to be successful. Secondly, the other, I mentioned cherries. We are really proud of our commodities here. We have over 200 commodities that we sell not only across the country, but around the world. The video mentioned our wines, our Pinot Noir, hands down the best in the country. I would argue the best in the world. And so we both send, raw products like blueberries and hazelnuts to places like Vietnam and Japan. We send more finished products, fabulous cheeses from places like Rogue Creamery overseas. Also, we send products like I was like oatmeal, Bob's Red Mill. I've seen on the shelves in stores in Japan and in China. So this is incredibly important to us. And it's about maintaining relationships. It's about connecting dots people, essentially. And it's about utilizing Oregon's natural assets. And I think it's all incredibly important. I do think that the federal government obviously plays an incredibly important role here.
Okay, I was going to say that one of my coping mechanisms for dealing with the disruptions of COVID has been to partake of some of the Oregon's finest Pinot Noir. It is very good, so I'll endorse that. But just one follow-up question, because you mentioned chips, semiconductors, and that's also a topic of great conversation here in Washington, sort of in two contexts. One, that we have a shortage, an immediate shortage of chips for important semiconductors for important products from ordinary, from your sort of personal devices to cars to defense materials. Big issue here. And interrelated with that is a concern, a sort of slightly longer term concern, but starting now, which is the competition with China. And so, again, I maybe focus on that latter part. I mean, you are out there in the Pacific Northwest. You're a Pacific state, and China is a Pacific country. It's an important market for you, but it's also a challenging competitor. And so I wonder how you sort of think about that balance, because we are having quite a fierce debate about that, and how, if you want to wind in the semiconductor story to that, that's fine. But I'm really interested in the sort of China dimension and how you deal with that challenge.
There's no question it's incredibly challenging. What I do think is that the Biden-Harris administration is taking the right approach, and we have to move forward, and we have to incent industries here, manufacturing, particularly the semiconductor industry here in the United States. I applaud the efforts around the CHIPS Act. We have got to do the research and development and manufacturing here. I think the pandemic has taught us is that there are systems that we have to have in place to ensure both economic viability for our communities across the United States, but also there has to be a level of self-sufficiency. I think PPE sounds really, really simple, protective gear, but when a little state like Oregon couldn't get the PPE that we needed, obviously we've been relying on overseas manufacturers. We had to figure out, and we couldn't get it, the supply we needed from the Trump administration. We had to create our own here. And so we went about working with the private sector to make that happen. And we were quite successful in doing that. Another area where we were extremely challenged was around food production. We grow really good beef here, Oregon country beef, but we don't have the processing capacity here. So our food systems were reliant on us being able to move, in this case, cattle to other states. We have got to be more self-sufficient than we are now. And I think that's true, honestly, as you move up and down the manufacturing chain, and particularly true in the technology sector. So I think we're going to have to make some conscientious decisions as states and as a nation about where we're going to be self-reliant. And I do think, obviously, in the healthcare arena, in the food arena, and in the technology arena, we're going to have to build the systems. And that's why I'm incredibly grateful for the work that the Biden-Harris administration, and frankly, that Congress is doing to ensure that that happens here in the United States.
Okay, should we take a couple of audience questions, Sarah?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. So we'll try and get a couple in with the time allotted. We've got one interesting question about forest products. So it says Oregon's a leading producer of forest products, also appears to be making a significant push to expand its mass timber design, manufacturing, construction industry. What's the role of that you envision for mass timber and underpinning the future of Oregon's forestry? And does it provide a model for how traditional natural resource sectors can be reimagined in a post-pandemic economy? Very nicely worded question.
Yes, all I can say is absolutely yes. The question was so well worded. I see mass timber, cross-laminated timber. There are a number of words that you can use to describe this industry. Oregon had one of the first manufacturers of this product here in the United States in Douglas County, a very small, rural, timber-dependent community. Again, this is an incredible opportunity for our communities that have been dependent on this natural resource to create really good paying jobs. We can create and develop buildings as a result of this product in a way that are more sustainable and frankly, more earthquake resilient. So I see it as a job creation, good for the environment, and of course, good for the economy. So it's a win-win-win.
Great. We have a question where, as you know, in this program, we're also talking to mayors of cities, and there's a question about cities, which is, what's the governor's opinion on the rising prevalence of cities as conduits and players in international policy? The viewer says LA has a foreign minister, which I guess I knew, and Portland has a series of sister cities as part of its international relations program. What is the role of cities in that context, and also more generally on the issues that we've been talking about?
Well, I love cities. I think what happens in cities is that folks, for example, in Portland, have the ability to create educational and cultural and economic ties that are incredibly strong and incredibly long-lasting. As a result of the strong ties that we have developed, for example, with Vietnam through Portland State University, located in the city of Portland, we've been able to leverage that to build stronger economic ties with the country of Vietnam. I traveled to Vietnam a couple of years ago, and it's an amazing country, but the groundwork was truly laid by citizens of Portland and really incredible, thoughtful folks at Portland State University. And it's, from my perspective, it's all about relationships. And cities are full of people that want to develop cultural and educational and economic relationships with other folks. And it's an incredible way to move our economies and our people forward together.
Well, Governor, we ask, we have lots of other questions coming through, but one question we ask each of our guests at the end of these really interesting conversations is, we're a bipartisan foreign policy think tank. And one thing that we've noticed in, both the Trump administration and now in the Biden administration has been this real focus on making sure that foreign policy, whether it's trade and economic policy or defense policy or just sort of relationships with other countries, they really work for the middle class or for the states. It really has to work for what's going on inside the country as well. What does it mean to have a foreign policy that works for Oregon in your perspective?
Well, I think it means making sure that we are developing policies that enable all of our citizens to thrive, and that we all have the opportunity to achieve our full potential. That's extremely broad, I know. I think what we haven't done intentionally in my state is to really look at our work around trade and ensure that we are lifting up the voices of our historically underserved communities. And that is some of the work that I hope to be doing moving forward. And I think it's an opportunity for all of us to work together and create both stronger educational ties, stronger cultural ties, and stronger economic ties with our partners overseas.
That's wonderful. Thank you. This is about all the time we have for the discussion today, but we just want to say a big thank you to Governor Brown for being with us today, and thank you for this really important discussion.
And thank you. Let me add my thanks to Sarah's. Thank you, Governor Brown. That was terrific. And another reason that I hope COVID ends soon, so we can get out there and enjoy Oregon and your wines. And by the way, can I just say one thing, which is the thing I was most nervous about in this interview was the pronunciation of your great state. We actually, to prep, we watched a video that you did showing us. Can you say it correctly to make sure that we got it right?
Oregon, you got it right.
Oregon, we did pretty well. Okay, that's good to know. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you both so much. This was just fabulous. I really appreciate the opportunity to participate.
Thanks for being with us, and to our audience, thank you for staying with us. And we will have the video up on the CSAS website soon. And please join us next month. We'll have another local or state official to join us for this program, Economy Disrupted. But for now, I'll say bye-bye. Thank you so much.